Growth doesn't always feel like peace when it's happening. In fact, sometimes it feels like chaos, like your thoughts are still pulling you towards old reactions, but something deeper in you refuses to follow. That's what recovery is. It's not about changing every thought that crosses your mind. It's about changing how you respond to them. Because the truth is, I didn't handle that week perfectly. I was scared, angry, and lonely, but I didn't drink, I didn't explode, and I didn't run. And those choices, those quiet, ordinary choices, were proof that I was growing even when I didn't feel strong.
You've tried to quit before. Maybe it worked for a while. Maybe it didn't. But deep down, you know sobriety isn't just about not drinking. It's about finding peace, purpose, and finding yourself again. Welcome to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Each week, Tim shares hard-earned lessons from his own decade of recovery, real talk, real methods, and the mindset that helped him turn the fight of sobriety into a life he actually loves. This is the Sober and Happy Podcast. Now, here's your host, Tim Phillips.
Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Sober and Happy Podcast. You know, recovery is full of these moments where you're doing everything right. You're showing up, you're doing the work, you're journaling, going to meetings, staying consistent, but you still feel stuck. Like, when do I finally start to feel better? That's one of the hardest places to be in recovery, because when we stop drinking, we expect life to start feeling good. Maybe not right away, but at least better than it did before, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just feels flat, like you're doing all this work, but nothing's really changing. And that's when those doubts start creeping in. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Maybe I'm just broken. Or the big one. If I've worked this hard and still don't feel better, what's the point? If you've ever felt that way, you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not failing. Because the truth is, growth doesn't always feel good while it's happening. In fact, sometimes it feels like nothing is happening at all. But underneath all that frustration and self-doubt, something is happening. You're changing in ways you can't see yet. It's like planting a seed. For weeks, it looks like nothing's happening on the surface. You water it, you give it sunlight, and you start to wonder if it's even working. But underground, the roots are taking hold. Quietly, slowly, building the foundation for what's coming next. And that's what recovery is like. You don't always see the progress in the moment, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. This week, I want to talk about how to trust the process, even when you can't see the results yet. Because sometimes the biggest growth doesn't show up as feeling better. It shows up as acting different, even when you still feel the same. When we first get sober, there's this incredible rush of relief and excitement. It's what a lot of people call the pink cloud. It's that feeling of hope, of possibility. You wake up clear-headed, maybe for the first time in years. You start thinking about everything that's suddenly within reach. Getting a better job, going back to school, finding love, buying a house, building a family, living that version of life that you always said you would have once you quit drinking. And that's a great feeling. That early optimism is powerful. It gives us momentum when we need it the most. But here's what usually happens. Those big dreams take time, a lot more time than we want them to. And when the excitement wears off and real life settles in, that's when many people start to struggle. Because even though we still have that sense of purpose, the instant feedback starts to disappear. At first, we're counting days, 30, 60, 90. We collect our chips and we celebrate milestones. That's something big and tangible to measure. But then those markers start to space out. 6 months, a year. The gap between those celebrations gets longer, and without those frequent reminders of progress, it's easy to start wondering if we're really growing at all. That's when it can feel like that pink cloud has drifted away, and all that's left is the quiet. And that quiet can be uncomfortable, especially for people like us who spent years chasing instant relief. When we drank, we always knew what to expect. Drink, feel different, repeat. And it didn't matter if the outcome was good or bad, at least it was immediate. But in recovery, there's no scoreboard that shows your progress. Sure, you could count your days, but you can't count the number of times you stayed calm when you would have exploded before. You can't track the nights you faced an emotion instead of running from it. You can't measure the moments you didn't react to that urge. And because we can't see that progress, it's easy to assume it's not happening. That's when those old thoughts start whispering, what's the point? Or maybe nothing's changing at all. But here's the truth. Recovery isn't about what's happening outside of you. It's about what's changing inside of you, even when you can't see it yet. Sometimes the biggest growth happens in the exact moments that feel the most frustrating, when you're holding ground, staying calm, or choosing not to run back to your old escape routes. You might not feel proud of that in the moment, but those are the quiet victories that build strength, the kind that lasts. And if you stay patient enough, those quiet victories eventually add up until one day you look back and realize you're not the same person who started this journey. One of the hardest parts about recovery is that you rarely notice your progress while it's happening. Growth doesn't announce itself. It's not like you wake up one day and suddenly feel peaceful or strong or healed. Usually it shows up quietly and only when you're looking back. So if you're at that place right now, the quiet part of recovery where it feels like you're going through the motions, I promise you, something is happening beneath the surface. You're rewiring how you think, how you react, and how you show up for yourself or for other people. You just might not see it yet. And for me, I didn't realize how much I had grown until life handed me one of the hardest tests of my sobriety. Something I could have never prepared for, but somehow was ready to face when it came. When I was about 11 months sober, I got a call from the prison chaplain where my dad was doing time. I was supposed to visit him the following week for Father's Day, but the chaplain told me something had changed. They'd discovered that my dad had cancer throughout his body, and if I wanted to see him, I needed to come now. That call hit hard. Even though I had my share of challenges in sobriety up to that point, this was my first real test. The kind of life moment that doesn't care how much work you've done. It was a 10-hour drive from Sacramento to Kingman, Arizona, with a lot of time to think, and honestly, probably overthink. The uncertainty hung over every mile, not knowing if my dad would still be alive when I got there. When I finally arrived, it was late evening. The main entrance was closed, so I had to check in through the ER. I gave them my dad's name, and the woman at the desk just said, "Nope, no one here by that name." I explained what the chaplain had told me, that this transfer had been arranged specifically for me to visit, but she just repeated the same line, "No one is here by that name." In that moment, everything in me wanted to explode, to yell, to demand answers, to let out all the anger and fear that had been building during that 10-hour drive. But the small voice inside me said, "If you lose it now, they'll kick you out and you'll never see your dad again." So I stayed calm, firm but calm, and kept explaining. Eventually, security showed up. They pulled me aside, and I was sure they were about to escort me off the property. But instead, I told the security guard everything, how I was newly sober, how I'd just driven 10 hours, how I didn't even know if my dad was still alive. I begged him to help me. He told me he couldn't confirm whether my dad was there because security protocols between the hospital and the prison. I said I understood, and I asked if he would just please call the chaplain who arranged this. He said he'd try. A few minutes later, he came back and said, "I don't know who you know to pull this off, but they're letting you see him." He told me that this never happens, and just like that, they searched me, escorted me inside, and I got to see my dad. That visit was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Saying goodbye to a parent is painful enough, but doing it in front of 2 armed prison guards takes it to a whole nother level. My dad also had a lot of wreckage from his life as an addict, and he spent that visit trying to unload it because he was trying to make peace before he passed. When he finally fell asleep that night, I remember feeling completely drained, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and I also felt incredibly alone. I had a lot of people from my home group who promised to check in with me, and honestly, most of them didn't. And for the first time in sobriety, I felt like AA had let me down. But I also knew there was supposed to be a meeting at the hospital that evening, and I was grateful for that, until I showed up, and no one else did. That was my breaking point. I felt forgotten, I felt unsupported, and I just wanted to escape. I still smoked at the time, so I went outside. Couldn't smoke on hospital grounds, so I walked out to the sidewalk, lit up, and just stood there, completely lost in my head. That's when I saw this guy walking across the parking lot towards me. He looked like he might be homeless, and I figured he was on his way to bum a smoke from me, and my first thought was, please don't, not right now. He asked me for a cigarette, and I handed him one. He lit it and asked, "Someone you know in the hospital?" And I said, "Yeah, my dad." He told me that his mom was there, but getting better, and that they'd be able to take her home soon. And then he said, "I hope your dad's going to be okay." I looked at him and said, "Unfortunately, he's dying." He got quiet, and I could tell he was really thinking about what to say next. Then he asked, "Can I pray for you and your dad?" Now, I wasn't a prayer guy. Growing up, religion was not a positive experience for me, so a prayer didn't exactly sound comforting. but for some reason, I still said yes. And I swear, I can't explain it, but when that man started praying, it felt like he had been in that room with us the last 24 hours. Every word he said was exactly what I needed to hear, and in some ways, what I think my dad needed also in his final days. When he finished, he just said amen, wished me the best, thanked me for the smoke, and walked away. I never saw him again. The next day, I stayed by my dad's bedside while he slept. That night, a nurse told me his vitals looked good and suggested I go back to my room to rest. I agreed. I took a shower, crawled into bed, and the moment my head hit the pillow, the phone rang. My dad had passed away. I went back to the hospital and sat with him for a while, trying to process everything. When I stepped out into the hallway, I barely had a moment to breathe before someone from the prison system and a hospital coroner started shoving paperwork in my face. Sign here so you could take ownership of your dad's body. I was standing there outside the room where my dad's body still was, and I could feel that old anger bubbling up again. The part of me that wanted to argue and tell him exactly where to shove that clipboard. And right as I was about to lose it, a nurse from a nearby station stood up, walked over and said, "You look like you need a cup of coffee. Let's go grab one." The two men tried to stop us, insisting I had to stay until we resolved this. The nurse looked at him and said, "His father died an hour ago. This could wait." They backed down, and he walked me into the break room. He made me a cup of coffee, sat with me for a few minutes, and just said, "I'm sorry for what you're going through." That was it. Simple. Human. But it meant everything. Between the stranger in the parking lot and that nurse in the break room, I finally felt supported. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel, got in my car, and started the long drive home. I still had a lot of emotions to work through, a lot of pain and questions and unfinished conversations with my father that would never be answered. But I also had a little peace. Peace in how I showed up for my dad. Peace in how I handled myself. Peace in knowing that the person I was in that hospital was not the same man who drove down there days before. And as I look back on that experience now, I could see all the moments where my growth made room for the grace I needed to walk through that situation. If I had lost my temper when I first arrived, I would have never seen my dad again. If I would have given up after that feeling of abandonment from my recovery support group, I would have never met that man in the parking lot. If I hadn't accepted that cup of coffee from that nurse, I might have walked away angry instead of feeling supported when I needed it. And a lot of people refer to those as God moments or divine intervention or angels showing up. And I'm not here to argue with any of that. But one thing I do know, none of those moments would have happened if I hadn't grown enough to stay calm, to stay open, and to stay sober through it all. And I never knew that I've grown that much in my first year of recovery until then. Before that experience, I thought my upcoming 1-year chip would be the ultimate proof of my growth. But now I realized it was so much more than that. Growth doesn't just change what you feel, it changes what you're able to experience. Because sometimes the good stuff doesn't show up until you make enough space for it to find you. That experience in Kingman taught me something that no meeting, no book, and no other person ever could. Growth doesn't always feel like peace when it's happening. In fact, sometimes it feels like chaos, like your thoughts are still pulling you towards old reactions, but something deeper in you refuses to follow. That's what recovery is. It's not about changing every thought that crosses your mind. It's about changing how you respond to them. Because the truth is, I didn't handle that week perfectly. I was scared, angry, and lonely. But I didn't drink. I didn't explode. I didn't run. And those choices, those quiet, ordinary choices, were proof that I was growing, even when I didn't feel strong. Looking back now, I could see that every small decision to pause, to breathe, to respond differently, opened the door for something good to enter my life. Things I might have missed if I'd still been living in chaos. Sometimes we want big, visible signs that we're changing. But the truth is, growth rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it looks like patience when you used to panic. It looks like calm when you used to lash out. It looks like staying present in moments that used to break you. That's how we find out who we're becoming, not on the easy days, but in the moments that test everything that we've learned. The funny thing about growth, it almost never feels good while it's happening. Most of the time, it just feels uncomfortable. When we're in it, it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like tension. It feels like fighting old instincts, like holding your tongue when you want to lash out, like taking a breath when everything inside you wants to explode. It feels like standing in the middle of an emotional storm and realizing that you don't have to run from it this time. That's the paradox of recovery. The moments that feel the hardest are often the ones proving how much stronger you've become. You don't always feel calm when you respond calmly. You don't always feel confident when you show up anyways. And you don't always feel peaceful when you're doing the right thing. But actions still matter because they are what builds the foundation for the peace that comes later. That trip to Kingman taught me that sometimes your actions evolve before your emotions catch up. You don't think your way into a new way of living. You live your way into a new way of thinking. And one day, when the dust settles, you'll realize that the person who handled that moment isn't the same person who would have faced it a year ago. That's how growth works. It doesn't always come with fireworks or some big emotional breakthrough. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's awkward. Sometimes it feels like you're just stumbling forward. But little by little, those moments add up. Every time you pause instead of react, every time you stay instead of running, every time you show up when it's hard, you're laying another brick in the foundation of the life that you're building. It might not look like much day to day, but one day you'll look around and realize this peace, this strength, this calm, it didn't just appear. You built it. And that's something to be proud of. You know, one of the most powerful parts of recovery is realizing how much of your growth you don't actually notice while it's happening. We spend so much time worrying about where we should be that we forget to notice how far we've already come. That's one of the reasons I'm such a believer in journaling. Because sometimes you don't realize how much you've grown until you look back and see it written in your own handwriting. There's been times I've opened an old journal looking for something specific and stumbled across an entry from 6 months ago. And I'll read it and think, wow, I was not handling that well. But what really hits me is realizing how differently I'd handle the same situation today. That's the kind of growth you'll never notice in real time, only in hindsight. When I think back to that trip to Kingman, I still don't know how everything lined up the way it did. The people who showed up at exactly the right moment, the calm that seemed to take over when everything around me was chaos. That wasn't luck. It didn't come from one big breakthrough. It came from showing up differently in 1,000 small moments leading up to that day. Every time I chose to pause instead of react, to ask for help instead of trying to control everything, I was unknowingly building the strength I would need for that moment. That's the beautiful thing about recovery. You rarely see the change while it's happening. But one day, life throws something at you that the old you could have never handled, and you realize you already have everything you need to walk through it. So here's this week's challenge. Take a few minutes to look back, not to shame yourself, but to recognize the progress that you have missed. Maybe that means flipping through an old journal entry or just thinking back to a situation that used to wreck you and asking yourself how you would handle it today. Notice the difference. Even if it's small, I want you to recognize it because growth doesn't always look like massive transformation. Sometimes it's just responding with a little more patience, a little more compassion, or a little more honesty than you used to. And that's enough. If you could start seeing those quiet shifts for what they are, proof that you're becoming stronger, calmer, and more grounded, it gets easier to keep going when the road feels slow. So if you're in that place right now where progress feels invisible, remember this. You might not see your growth yet, but it is happening. One calm response, one honest choice, one brave moment at a time. Until next time, my friends, thank you so much for listening. Keep living sober and happy.
Thanks for listening to the Sober and Happy podcast with Tim Phillips. If today's episode connected with you, share it with someone who needs it. You can follow Tim on social at I Am Sober and Happy and visit soberandhappy.com for tools, motivation, and more episodes. Remember, quitting drinking is just the beginning. The real goal is learning to love yourself and love your life. This has been the Sober and Happy podcast. See you next time.